Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Louisiana Bayou. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1911, and Cypress Mill, a small settlement nestled deep in the Louisiana Bayou, had long been a place where time seemed to move differently than the rest of the world. The settlement was little more than a collection of weathered wooden structures straddling the edge of a slow-moving waterway where Spanish moss draped from ancient cypress trees like funeral shrouds. Most folks in the neighboring parishes hardly knew it existed, and those who did rarely spoke of it. There was something about the place that didn't sit right with outsiders, a heaviness in the air that pressed down on your chest and made breathing feel like work. To reach Cypress Mill, one had to navigate through a maze of narrow waterways, where the boundaries between water and land blurred into a confusing tapestry of mud and reeds. The community existed in relative isolation, connected to the outside world only by occasional traders and those brave enough to navigate the treacherous waters. Most residents were descendants of early French settlers, Acadians who had found refuge in the swamps generations earlier, along with a scattering of immigrants who had sought to escape the scrutiny of authorities in more populated areas. At the edge of this forgotten place stood a grand house, or what passed for grand in those parts, a two-story cypress structure with a wide veranda that wrapped around three sides. Unlike the other humble dwellings of Cypress Mill, this house possessed a certain elegance that seemed out of place amid the primitive surroundings. It belonged to Madame Valyria Maro, a woman in her early 40s, whose mysterious past was the subject of much speculation among the locals. No one knew exactly where she had come from or how she had acquired the means to build such a home, but the prevailing rumor was that she had been the companion of a wealthy New Orleans businessman before his untimely demise. Valyria was neither beautiful nor particularly charming, but she possessed something far more powerful, an air of quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding it. Her skin had the pallor of someone who avoided the harsh Louisiana sun, and her dark hair was always pulled back in a severe style that emphasized her sharp features. She dressed in fine clothes that seemed to belong to another era, and she spoke with the refined accent of someone who had received a proper education which set her apart from the rough local dialect. The people of Cypress Mill regarded Madame Maro with a mixture of respect and unease. She was known for her generosity during times of hardship, providing food and medicine to families in need. Yet there was something in her gaze, a coldness, a calculation, that made people uncomfortable in her presence. Men, in particular, seemed both drawn to and wary of her, often finding reasons to pass by her property, but rarely lingering long. Valyria's house sat at the end of a long, winding path, partially obscured by a curtain of Spanish moss and cypress trees. It was a place that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight, even during the brightest hours of the day. The veranda was adorned with delicate ironwork and furnished with rocking chairs that somehow always seemed to be in slight motion, even when no one was seated in them. Behind the house was a garden where Valyria grew herbs and vegetables, tended with meticulous care. The house was known for its elaborate dinners, to which Valyria occasionally invited travelers passing through the area. These were rare social events in the isolated community, and those who received such invitations considered it both an honor and somehow a burden they couldn't refuse. The meals were said to be exceptional, flavors that couldn't be found elsewhere in the parish, prepared with ingredients from Valyria's garden, and techniques she claimed to have learned in her travels. What made these dinners particularly notable was that they were exclusively for men, single men, widowers, or those traveling without companionship. When questioned about this peculiar arrangement, Valyria would simply explain that she enjoyed masculine conversation and found the company of men more stimulating than that of women. The men who attended these dinners often spoke of the experience with a strange mixture of appreciation and discomfort, as if they had enjoyed themselves but couldn't articulate exactly why they felt unsettled afterward. It was in the early spring of 1911 when people began to notice a pattern. Men who dined at Madame Maro's house would often leave the following morning, continuing their journey through the Bayou. This was not unusual in itself. Travelers rarely stayed long in Cypress Mill. What became troubling was the realization that many of these men were never seen or heard from again once they left the settlement. The first to make this connection was Josephine Thibodeau, the postmistress of Cypress Mill. Her tiny post office served as the community's primary link to the outside world, and she prided herself on keeping track of who came and went. Josephine had noticed that several letters addressed to men who had passed through remained unclaimed, with no forwarding address ever provided. In each case, she recalled, the men had been guests at Valyria's dinner table before their departure. "I don't like to speak ill of anyone," Josephine confided to her brother Marcel one humid evening, as they sat on the porch of her small cabin. "But there's something not right about those dinners at Madame Maro's place. Remember that surveyor from Baton Rouge who came through in February? Henri Lafleur, I believe his name was." Marcel nodded, taking a slow drag from his pipe. "Tall fellow with the mustache? Said he was mapping the waterways for some new project?" "That's the one. He dined with Madame Maro the night before he was to leave. Told everyone he'd be heading back toward Baton Rouge at first light." Josephine's voice dropped to a whisper, though there was no one else around to hear. But Armand Fontenot, who was fishing near the North Passage that morning, swears he never saw Lafleur's boat pass by, and Armand, for all his faults, has eyes like a hawk. "Maybe he took another route," Marcel suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "Maybe, but his office in Baton Rouge sent a letter 2 weeks later asking after him. Said he never returned, and they were concerned." Josephine leaned forward, her expression grave. "And he's not the only one, Marcel. There's been at least 3 others since Christmas, men who ate at her table and then vanished like morning mist." Josephine began keeping a discreet record in a small notebook she kept beneath the counter. Names, dates, descriptions, anything she could remember about the visitors who vanished. She was careful not to share her concerns openly, for Madame Maro held considerable influence in Cypress Mill, and accusations without evidence could be dangerous. Instead, she confided in Marcel, who worked on the steamboats that occasionally passed through the larger waterways near the settlement. Marcel took his sister's concerns seriously enough to make inquiries at ports along the river. He discovered that none of the men in question had been seen in any of the towns where they had been expected. It was as if they had simply vanished into the swamp itself. But the bayou, for all its dangers, couldn't account for so many disappearances without leaving some trace. A capsized boat, a body caught in the roots of a cypress tree, some evidence of misfortune. "It ain't natural," Marcel told Josephine upon his return. "I spoke to the harbor master in Terrebonne Parish. He keeps detailed records of all boats coming and going. None of these men ever made it that far. And when I mentioned Cypress Mill, he gave me a strange look, like he knew something but didn't want to say it." "What do you think it means?" Josephine asked, her voice barely audible over the chorus of insects that had begun their nightly symphony outside her window. Marcel was silent for a long moment, the glow of his pipe illuminating the deep lines of concern on his weathered face. "I think," he said finally, "that we need to be very careful around Madame Maro. And perhaps we should warn the next traveler who receives an invitation to her table." Jérôme, the mystery deepened when a traveler named Everett Walsh arrived in Cypress Mill in May of 1911. Walsh was a photographer from Boston who had been commissioned by a national magazine to document the unique culture and landscape of the Louisiana Bayou. He was an educated man in his 30s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a meticulous approach to his work. Unlike many visitors who seemed uncomfortable in the unfamiliar environment, Walsh embraced the strangeness of the swamp, finding beauty in its wild isolation. Inevitably, Walsh's presence drew the attention of Madame Maro, who invited him to dine at her house. The photographer accepted, seeing an opportunity to capture images of one of the more impressive homes in the area. He arrived at Valyria's house on a humid evening, his camera equipment carefully packed away in leather cases. The dinner was said to be exceptional, with dishes Walsh had never encountered before, seasoned with herbs from Valyria's garden. The conversation flowed as easily as the wine, with Walsh sharing stories of his travels and Valyria listening with rapt attention. The following morning, Walsh did not continue his journey as planned. Instead, he stayed in Cypress Mill, renting a room at the small boarding house run by the widow Arsenault. He told anyone who asked that he had found the perfect subject for his photographic essay, not just the bayou itself, but Cypress Mill and its residents. He was particularly interested in documenting Madame Maro's house, which he described as a remarkable example of colonial architecture preserved in isolation. For several days, Walsh could be seen around the settlement, capturing images of everyday life, fishermen with their catches, women hanging laundry, men building and repairing boats along the edge of the water. But he seemed particularly drawn to Valyria's property, where he spent hours photographing the house from different angles, paying special attention to the garden behind the main structure. Valyria appeared to welcome his interest, even inviting him to additional meals. Their conversations, overheard by Valyria's housekeeper, Odette, often turned to the topic of the men who had passed through Cypress Mill, travelers and wanderers seeking something or escaping something. Walsh seemed particularly interested in documenting their stories, asking Valyria if she kept any record of her dinner guests. "They come and go like shadows passing through," Valyria had replied, according to Odette's later account. "Some leave more of an impression than others, but all contribute something to this place, whether they realize it or not." It was after one such dinner, about a week into his stay, that Walsh's behavior began to change. He became withdrawn, spending less time photographing and more time alone in his rented room. When he did venture out, he appeared distracted, jumping at unexpected sounds and constantly glancing over his shoulder. The widow Arsenault reported that he sometimes spoke in his sleep, uttering phrases she couldn't understand but that seemed to distress him greatly. Josephine noticed that Walsh had begun sending frequent letters, far more than would be expected for a man on a simple assignment. When she casually asked about his correspondence, he muttered something about insurance and quickly changed the subject. Once she glimpsed one of the envelopes addressed to a law office in Boston, which struck her as odd for a photographer. 12 days after his arrival in Cypress Mill, Walsh approached Marcel Thibodeau at the small dock where he repaired boats. The photographer's usually neat appearance had deteriorated. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from apparent lack of sleep. He asked Marcel about the fastest way to reach New Orleans, saying he needed to return to civilization urgently. Marcel offered to arrange passage on a steamboat that would be passing nearby in 2 days. Walsh seemed relieved but anxious about the delay. 2 days, he repeated, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "I suppose I can manage that as long as—" He didn't complete the sentence, but his gaze drifted toward the direction of Valyria's house. "Is something troubling you, Mr. Walsh?" Marcel asked, choosing his words carefully. "You seem unsettled." Walsh hesitated, his eyes darting around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Have you ever noticed," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "how many men visit Madame Maro's house and then disappear? How the garden behind her house flourishes more than any other in the region? How the soil there is darker, richer than anywhere else in this godforsaken swamp?" Marcel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze coming off the water. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Walsh?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Walsh replied, suddenly defensive. "I'm merely making observations. That's my job, after all. To observe, to document. He adjusted his glasses, which had slipped down his nose. But if I were you, Mr. Thibodeau, I would start keeping track of who goes into that house and who comes out. The numbers might not add up as neatly as you'd expect. Before Marcel could respond, Walsh turned and walked away, his posture tense, like a man expecting a blow from behind. Marcel watched him go, the photographer's words confirming the suspicions he and Josephine had harbored for months, but had been reluctant to voice aloud. That evening, Walsh was seen entering Madame Maro's house one final time. According to Odette, who later spoke to Josephine, he had come to collect his camera equipment, which he had left behind during his previous visit. Valyria had invited him to stay for tea, an invitation he had reluctantly accepted. What transpired during that last visit remains largely unknown. Odette claimed to have served the tea and then retired to the kitchen, where she could hear the murmur of conversation, but not the specific words being exchanged. At some point she heard raised voices, followed by a sudden silence. When she returned to the parlor, Walsh was gone, and Valyria was sitting calmly in her chair, sipping her tea as if nothing had happened. "Where did Mr. Walsh go?" Odette had asked, noticing that his camera equipment still sat by the door. "He received some news that required his immediate attention," Valyria replied, without looking up from her cup. "He left in quite a hurry. I told him I would keep his equipment safe until he returns." Her tone was casual, but something in the set of her shoulders, the stillness of her posture, struck Odette as unusual. Valyria was typically a woman of small, elegant movements, a graceful turn of the wrist, a deliberate tilt of the head. But in that moment she seemed frozen, like a predator waiting to see if its prey would stir again. Walsh never returned to the boarding-house that night. The widow Arsenault reported his absence to Josephine the following morning, concerned that he had left without collecting his belongings or settling his bill. A quick search of his room revealed that his personal items remained, clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, a notebook on the bedside table, even his wallet containing several dollars. Only his camera equipment was missing, and that, they knew, was still at Valyria's house. Marcel organized a search party, more out of concern for a fellow outsider than any genuine alarm. Men from the settlement checked the usual places where a stranger might come to harm. The deeper parts of the bayou, the treacherous mud flats that could swallow a man whole, the areas known to be frequented by alligators. They found nothing, no sign that Walsh had met with an accident or become disoriented in the unfamiliar terrain. It was 3 days later, after the steamboat had come and gone without Walsh, that Josephine decided to examine the notebook he had left behind. Her position as postmistress had given her a flexible interpretation of privacy, justified by concern for a missing man. The notebook contained detailed observations about Cypress Mill and its inhabitants, written in a clear, methodical hand. The final entries, however, revealed that Walsh had come to Cypress Mill with a purpose beyond his photographic assignment. "I have confirmed that Gregory Sullivan dined here before his disappearance," one entry read, as did Thomas Hargrove and William Fletcher. "All three were last seen at Madame M's table. This cannot be coincidence." Another entry, dated just 2 days before Walsh vanished, was more alarming. "The garden, the disturbance in the soil is recent and extensive. What grows so abundantly in ground so enriched? I must examine the photographs more carefully." The last entry, written in a hasty scrawl unlike his usual neat penmanship, contained just a few lines. "She knows I've discovered something. The tea tasted strange. I managed to spill most of it. Must get to Eno with the plates. Evidence in the garden. The soil contains more than just plant matter." Josephine's hand shook as she closed the notebook. The implications were too horrific to contemplate, yet they aligned perfectly with the pattern she and Marcel had observed. Men entering Valyria's house, never to be seen again. The unusually bountiful garden, the strange, secretive demeanor of a woman who had appeared in their community without explanation or connections. "We need to go to her house," Josephine told Marcel after showing him the notebook. "We need to see what's in that garden." Marcel shook his head, his expression grim. "Not just us. We need others, witnesses, and someone with authority." When Marcel read the notebook, he insisted on approaching the local authorities. But in a place as isolated as Cypress Mill, official law enforcement was a distant concept. The nearest sheriff was in a town several hours away by boat, and his jurisdiction over the scattered settlements in the Bayou was more theoretical than practical. Instead, Marcel gathered several men from the community, including Josephine's husband Antoine and the aging Dr. Broussard, who had once been the physician for the entire parish before retiring to the quieter pace of Cypress Mill. Their plan was simple: to visit Madame Maro's house under the pretense of continuing the search for Walsh, and to request permission to examine the property, particularly the garden mentioned in his notes. They arrived at the house in the late afternoon, when the shadows of the cypress trees stretched like long fingers across the property. Valyria received them on her veranda, seemingly unsurprised by their visit. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a dark dress that emphasized her pallor. She expressed appropriate concern about Walsh's disappearance, suggesting that perhaps he had decided to continue his journey without informing anyone, a common enough occurrence with itinerant photographers and writers who pass through the area. "It is kind of you to be concerned," she said, offering them seats on the veranda. "Though I must admit, I find it curious that so much attention is being paid to the absence of a man who was, after all, merely passing through. How many others come and go from Cypress Mill without anyone noting their departure?" There was something challenging in her tone, as if daring them to acknowledge the pattern they had observed. Marcel met her gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "Mr. Walsh left his belongings at the boarding house," he said, "including money and important papers. It seems unlikely he would depart voluntarily without them. People in distress often act in ways that seem illogical to others," Valyria countered smoothly. "Perhaps he received troubling news or remembered an urgent commitment elsewhere." "You were the last person to see him," Antoine Thibodeau interjected, his normally gentle voice hardened by suspicion. "He came here to collect his camera equipment, but that too was left behind." Valyria's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, a momentary calculation, quickly concealed. "Yes, he was quite agitated when he arrived. He asked for his equipment, but then seemed to change his mind, saying he would return for it later. He left on foot, heading toward the north path." The men exchanged glances. The north path led deeper into the swamp, away from the usual routes travelers took when leaving Cypress Mill. It was a direction that made no sense for a man supposedly eager to return to civilization. When Marcel mentioned their desire to search the grounds, particularly the garden, a subtle change came over Valyria's expression. Not alarm, but a sharpening of attention, like a predator assessing a potential threat. Nevertheless, she granted permission with a gracious wave of her hand, even offering to show them around personally. "Though I fail to see what you expect to find in my humble garden," she added, leading them around the side of the house, "it is merely a place where I grow vegetables and herbs for my table, hardly a location of mystery or intrigue." The garden behind the house was larger than it appeared from a distance, stretching back toward the edge of the swamp in neat, orderly rows. Vegetables and herbs grew in abundance: tomatoes, peppers, unusual varieties of greens that Dr. Broussard couldn't identify, despite his extensive knowledge of local flora. The soil was dark and rich, and the plants more vibrant and lush than seemed natural in the often difficult growing conditions of the Bayou. "My secret," Valyria explained when Dr. Broussard commented on the extraordinary fertility of her garden, "is in the soil preparation. I have my own special mixture that seems to work wonders." As the men moved through the garden, they noticed areas of freshly turned earth near the back, closest to where the cultivated land gave way to the wild swamp. Marcel exchanged a glance with Antoine, who nodded subtly. While the others continued to engage Valyria in conversation, the two men drifted toward the disturbed area. "The ground here has been worked recently," Marcel observed, crouching to examine the soil more closely. "Are you planting something new, Madame Maro?" Valyria moved toward them with a grace that belied the tension evident in the set of her shoulders. "I rotate my crops regularly. It helps maintain the soil's vitality." Marcel nodded as if accepting her explanation, but his attention had been caught by something partially buried near the edge of the freshly turned earth. A flash of white, too smooth and curved to be a stone. He reached out, brushing away the dirt to reveal what lay beneath. "Don't touch that," Valyria said sharply, her composed demeanor cracking for the first time. But it was too late. Marcel had already unearthed the object, a bone fragment, unmistakably human, with traces of what looked like heat damage along one end. What happened next became the subject of much speculation and conflicting accounts in the years that followed. According to the official statement given to the sheriff when he finally arrived 2 days later, Marcel and Antoine discovered human remains buried in the garden, fragments that showed signs of having been altered, as if to break them down more quickly. Further excavation revealed more remains, belonging to several different individuals based on Dr. Broussard's preliminary examination. Valyria Maro offered no resistance when the men confronted her with their discovery. Instead, she invited them into her house, suggesting that they discuss the matter over dinner. The invitation was declined. Under guard in her own parlor, Valyria supposedly remained calm, even detached, as if the unearthing of human remains in her garden was a minor inconvenience rather than a revelation of horror. "You cannot understand what I have accomplished here," she reportedly told Dr. Broussard as they waited for authorities to arrive. "These men, these drifters and wanderers, they were nothing in life, forgotten by their families, unmoored from society, contributing nothing of value to the world. In my garden they have found purpose. They have nourished life." The doctor, disturbed by her lack of remorse, asked how many men she had killed. Valyria merely smiled, a distant expression, as if recalling a pleasant memory. "I prefer to think of it as transformation rather than destruction. How many seeds must be planted before a garden flourishes? How many ingredients must be combined before a recipe achieves perfection?" When questioned directly about Walsh and the other missing men, Valyria's responses were enigmatic. "They contributed," she allegedly told Dr. Broussard. "Each in their own way, they nourished something greater than themselves. Most men leave nothing behind when they pass through this world. These men left abundance." The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies, having been summoned by a message Marcel had sent via a passing boat. By then, more remains had been discovered, not just in the garden, but in a small shed at the property's edge that contained tools, barrels of an unidentified substance that Dr. Broussard suspected was some form of chemical compound, and a large stone basin with troubling stains. Inside the house, further evidence came to light. A hidden compartment beneath the parlor floorboards contained personal effects belonging to the missing men: watches, wallets, small items of jewelry or sentimental value. Even more disturbing was the discovery of a leather-bound book in Valyria's bedroom containing detailed notes on each man who had dined at her table. Physical descriptions, observations about their mannerisms and preferences, assessments of their quality, all recorded in a neat, dispassionate hand, like a gardener cataloging varieties of plants. May 12, 1911. E. Walsh, photographer from Boston. Lean build, nervous energy, observant, too curious. Quality compromised by suspicion. Unlikely to integrate well into the garden. Requires special processing. The final pages of the book contained recipes, not ordinary cooking instructions, but elaborate preparations involving unusual ingredients. The recipes were annotated with comments about flavor profiles and nutritional benefits, as if they were entries in a conventional cookbook rather than documents of something far more sinister. Valyria was taken into custody and transported to the parish seat for formal charging and trial. The case attracted attention from newspapers as far away as New Orleans, drawn by the lurid details that emerged during the investigation. According to testimony from Odette and others, Valyria had been systematically selecting men who would not be missed: drifters, solitary travelers, men estranged from their families, and inviting them to dine at her table. What happened after these dinners was pieced together from physical evidence and Valyria's own cryptic statements during her interrogation. The men were apparently drugged, possibly with something added to their food or drink. Then their remains were processed in the shed behind the house. Their remains were treated with chemicals to accelerate decomposition, then used to fertilize Valyria's garden, explaining the extraordinary fertility of the soil and the abundance of her harvest. More disturbing still were the indications that Valyria may have incorporated unusual ingredients into the meals she served to subsequent guests, a perverse cycle that had continued for an unknown period before Walsh's suspicions led to its discovery. This aspect of the case was handled delicately in public records, often alluded to rather than explicitly stated, out of respect for both the victims and public sensibilities. During the pre-trial hearings, alienists, as psychiatrists were then called, were brought in to examine Valyria, seeking to determine if she was mentally sound enough to stand trial. Their reports described a woman of exceptional intelligence and self-possession, who spoke eloquently about her actions without exhibiting any sign of remorse or moral understanding of their wrongness. The subject appears to regard human beings as fundamentally no different from other organic matter, one alienist wrote. She expresses the view that in death, a person becomes merely material to be utilized, no different from a plant or animal. This perspective, while obviously deviant and suggestive of a profound moral defect, is held with such conviction and articulated with such clarity that it cannot be dismissed as mere insanity. Another examiner noted that Valyria seemed to take pride in what she called her cultivation system, viewing it as a form of art or science rather than a series of crimes. She speaks of her garden in terms a mother might use about her family, the report stated. There is genuine tenderness in her voice when she describes the growth and harvest of plants nourished by her special fertilizer. The disconnect between her aesthetic appreciation of her garden and the means by which it was cultivated indicates a profound dissociation from conventional human empathy. Despite these assessments, Valyria was deemed legally sane and fit to stand trial. The prosecution's case was built on the physical evidence recovered from her property, the testimony of Cypress Mill residents about the pattern of disappearances, and the detailed records Valyria herself had kept of her activities. The defense, appointed by the court since Valyria had no means to hire her own representation, attempted to argue that she suffered from delusions that prevented her from understanding the criminal nature of her actions. The trial of Valyria Maro was brief by the standards of such sensational cases. She declined to take the stand in her own defense, speaking little during the proceedings except to occasionally correct what she perceived as technical inaccuracies in the prosecution's presentation of evidence. She neither confirmed nor denied the charges directly, maintaining an air of detached dignity that many observers found more disturbing than any display of emotion would have been. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Valyria was sentenced to death, a sentence she received with the same eerie composure that had characterized her throughout the trial. She was transferred to the state prison to await execution. It was during this period of incarceration that the case took another unexpected turn. A month before her scheduled execution, Valyria began to speak more openly to the prison chaplain who visited her cell. Her conversations, dutifully recorded in the chaplain's journal, revealed aspects of her background previously unknown. Valyria claimed to be the daughter of a once prominent family that had lost everything during the Civil War. Raised in genteel poverty, she had married young to a man who promised to restore her family's fortune, but who proved to be cruel and controlling. After years of abuse, she had fled, taking with her the only thing of value her husband possessed: a book of botanical formulas and agricultural techniques passed down through his family for generations. He never appreciated what he had, she told the chaplain. He saw only a collection of recipes and gardening advice, nothing more. He couldn't understand the deeper wisdom contained in those pages, the perfect cycle of nourishment and growth that transcends conventional boundaries. Using this knowledge, she had established herself in Cypress Mill, where isolation provided both safety from her past and freedom to experiment with the techniques described in the book. According to the chaplain's records, Valyria spoke of her garden with more passion than she ever showed regarding the men she had killed, describing it as the only pure thing in a corrupt world. Most chilling were her reflections on her victims. They were already empty, she told the chaplain, hollow men drifting through life without purpose. I gave them purpose. Through me they brought life from the soil. Through me they nourished others. In death they were more useful than they ever were in life. The chaplain, disturbed by these conversations, but committed to offering spiritual counsel until the end, asked Valyria if she felt any remorse for the pain she had caused to the families of the missing men. Her response was characteristically detached. "What families?" she replied. "I chose carefully. Men who were already lost, already separated from any meaningful connection. Their absence created no void in the world, but their transformation in my garden created abundance, beauty, sustenance. If their distant relatives could see what they became part of, they would feel pride rather than grief." As her execution date approached, Valyria made one unusual request: that samples from her garden be preserved and studied, particularly certain rare varieties of herbs she claimed to have developed through her specialized cultivation methods. The request was denied, with authorities determining that all organic material from the property should be destroyed to prevent any possibility of contamination. Valyria Maro was executed by hanging on October 17, 1911. She declined to make a final statement, though witnesses reported that she smiled slightly as the hood was placed over her head. Not a smile of fear or defiance, but one of secret satisfaction, as if she knew something the observers did not. In the aftermath of the case, Cypress Mill withered away. Many residents, unable to shake the shadow that Valyria had cast over their community, chose to relocate to other settlements along the Bayou. The house itself was initially boarded up by order of the sheriff, but eventually it was reclaimed by the swamp, as vines and roots broke through the floors and walls, pulling the structure slowly back into the earth. Within a decade, little remained to indicate that people had ever lived there at all. The garden, however, persisted long after the house had crumbled. According to accounts from occasional hunters and trappers who passed through the area, the land where Valyria had grown her infamous harvest continued to produce vegetation of unusual size and vitality for years, as if the soil retained some memory of its grisly enrichment. Strange plants with unfamiliar properties sometimes appeared: herbs with unusually potent medicinal effects, vegetables with flavors not found elsewhere in the region. Local folk wisdom advised against consuming anything found growing on the former Maro property, warning that to do so was to invite madness or worse. As decades passed, the story of Valyria Maro and her Garden of Horrors gradually transformed from recent history to local legend. Parents in neighboring parishes would warn their wayward teenagers not to venture too deep into the bayou, lest they stumble upon the remnants of Cypress Mill and fall prey to the widow's lingering influence. The tale became a cautionary story about the dangers of accepting hospitality from strangers, particularly those who lived alone in isolated places. In 1967, a graduate student from Tulane University, researching folk traditions of the Louisiana Bayou, came across mentions of the Maro case in old newspaper archives. Intrigued, he sought out the few remaining individuals who claimed some connection to Cypress Mill or knowledge of the events of 1911. Most of these accounts were second-hand or third-hand by then, colored by decades of retelling and elaboration. One interview, however, stood out. The student located Odette's niece, by then an elderly woman living in a nursing home in Lafayette. Though she had been a young woman at the time of the murders, she claimed to remember Valyria clearly, particularly the calm that always surrounded her, like the eye of a hurricane. Or more significantly, she possessed several items that had belonged to her aunt, including a small journal in which Odette had recorded her experiences working in Valyria's house. The journal contained descriptions of the dinner preparations, the strange ingredients Valyria sometimes incorporated, and observations about the guests who never returned. The most disturbing entry, dated just a week before Walsh's disappearance, described Odette's accidental discovery of a hidden compartment beneath the pantry floor. Inside, she had found a book, not the agricultural text Valyria later mentioned to the chaplain, but something far older, with pages of brittle vellum covered in writing in a language Odette didn't recognize. Accompanying the text were illustrations of plants intertwined with human forms in a manner that had frightened the housekeeper enough that she had carefully replaced the book and never mentioned her discovery to Valyria. The drawings showed people becoming plants, the journal entry read. Not in a fanciful way like stories of men turned into trees, but in a cold, methodical way. Diagrams showing how a human body could be broken down and incorporated into the soil, how specific elements could nourish specific plants. And the most terrible thing, illustrations of people consuming those plants with expressions of ecstasy on their faces, as if they were experiencing some transcendent pleasure. I closed the book and returned it to its hiding place, but I cannot unsee what I saw. I cannot unhear the whispers that seemed to come from those ancient pages. The student included this account in his thesis, though he noted that by 1967 it was impossible to verify or disprove. The house was long gone, the site inaccessible due to changes in the bayou's flow over the decades. The book, if it had existed, was presumably lost when the house finally succumbed to the encroaching swamp. What remained were the stories, whispered accounts of travelers who still occasionally disappeared in that part of the bayou, of strange lights seen hovering over the site where Cypress Mill had once stood, of plants with unusual properties that sometimes appeared in local markets, brought in by trappers who would not reveal their source, and perhaps most enduring of all, the habit that developed throughout the parishes surrounding the bayou, a tradition passed down through generations without explicit explanation. The deep-seated reluctance to accept dinner invitations from strangers, particularly those who lived alone in isolated places, and the warning still whispered to travelers even today. Be careful what you eat in another's house, for you never know what might be feeding on you. In 1968, all materials related to the Maro case were sealed by order of the State Historical Society, citing concerns about the sensationalistic and potentially defamatory nature of accounts that could not be substantiated through official records. Access was restricted to academic researchers with specific approval, effectively removing the story from public circulation. It wasn't until 2003 that the restriction was lifted, allowing the full details to emerge into historical record. By then, Cypress Mill had been largely forgotten, its location submerged beneath the waters of a reservoir created by a flood control project in the 1970s. Engineers working on the project reported finding unusual plant specimens in the area, along with fragments of material embedded in the roots of ancient cypress trees, but these discoveries were documented only in technical reports that received little attention outside scientific circles. Among the materials made available to the public in 2003 was a series of photographs attributed to Everett Walsh, images that had apparently been developed from plates found in a waterproof case that surfaced during the reservoir construction. The photograph showed Valyria's garden from various angles, capturing the lush growth and careful arrangement of plants. But in certain images, something more disturbing could be discerned: shapes beneath the soil that suggested disturbing anomalies, with plants growing in patterns that seemed to follow the outline of what once might have been human forms. More chilling still were the close-up images of certain plants, vegetables with surface patterns reminiscent of skin textures, herbs with leaves that formed structures similar to human anatomical features, plants that seemed to incorporate unusual structures into their growth. Whether these aberrations were natural mutations, the result of Valyria's cultivation techniques, or simply tricks of light and shadow, remains a subject of debate among the few scholars who have studied the photographs in depth. The final photograph in the sequence, apparently taken inside Valyria's house, showed a dinner table set for two with a meal laid out in elegant presentation. The accompanying note, written in Walsh's hand on the back of the image, contained just 3 words: "She serves herself." Experts who have analyzed the Walsh photographs and the accompanying documentation suggest that Valyria Maro may have been practicing a form of ritualistic activity combined with experimental agriculture. Her methods created a cycle of transformation that aligned with ancient practices found in certain isolated cultures throughout history. The Maro case represents a unique intersection of practical murderous intent with a kind of perverted spiritual practice, wrote Dr. Amelia Fontaine in her 2010 analysis published in the Journal of Historical Criminology. Unlike most serial killers, who are motivated by psychological compulsion or personal gratification, Maro appears to have viewed her actions as part of a larger natural cycle, a system of cultivation that transcended conventional boundaries between life and death, between human and plant, between predator and prey. This interpretation is supported by fragments of writing attributed to Valyria herself, discovered in 2015, among the personal effects of the prison chaplain who attended her in her final days. These notes, never before made public, reveal a worldview that defies conventional categorization. The garden is the perfect expression of the universal truth, that all life feeds on death, that all growth requires dissolution. Society pretends otherwise, hiding its slaughterhouses behind walls, burying its dead in sealed boxes, separating the consumption of life from the reality of death. But in my garden, this pretense falls away. The cycle is complete, visible, honest. The men who feed my soil become the plants that feed other men. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is lost. Everything transforms. Yet the legacy of Valyria Maro lives on in the collective memory of the Bayou. In certain remote settlements, they still speak of her in hushed tones as the day fades into evening. The widow who transformed suffering into abundant growth, who found in death a perfect recipe for life. And they say, if you travel deep enough into the Bayou, to where the water is dark and still and the cypress trees form a cathedral of shadow, you can sometimes catch the scent of a garden impossibly lush, bearing fruit too perfect to be natural. They say if you follow that scent, you might come upon a table set for dinner with a place waiting just for you. They say a woman will greet you, neither young nor old, neither beautiful nor plain, with eyes that reflect no light and a smile that promises sustenance. And they say that many have accepted her invitation, partaken of her hospitality, and contributed, in their way, to the cycle she began more than a century ago. For in the Bayou, Nothing truly ends. It merely changes form, becomes part of something else. Something that continues to grow and feed and wait for the next traveler who wanders too far from the known paths, driven by hunger or curiosity, or the simple human need to be welcomed at a stranger's table. In recent years, reports have emerged from the region of unusually abundant harvests in certain isolated areas of the bayou, of vegetables with peculiar textures and extraordinary flavors, of herbs with unexpected medicinal properties. Local markets sometimes feature these products, brought in by solitary figures who appear before dawn and disappear shortly after selling their goods. Those who consume these strange harvests often report vivid dreams, dreams of a garden where the boundaries between plant and human blur, where roots extend like fingers into the earth, where flowers open to reveal faces with expressions of sublime peace. They wake with a hunger that normal food cannot satisfy, a yearning for something they cannot name but feel compelled to seek. And occasionally, a traveler disappears from the winding roads that now cut through parts of the bayou. Usually men traveling alone, often those without strong ties to family or community. Their vehicles are found abandoned, their possessions left behind, as if they simply stepped out of their lives and into the waiting embrace of the swamp. Some say they have glimpsed, in the deepest parts of the bayou, where modern development has not yet reached, a solitary figure tending a garden in a clearing where no house stands, but where the soil is dark and rich, and the plants grow with unnatural vigor. A woman in outdated clothing moving with deliberate grace among rows of lush vegetation, sometimes kneeling to whisper to the plants as if sharing secrets or singing them lullabies. Is it Valyria Maro, somehow returned from the grave, a descendant who discovered her methods? Or merely the projection of a collective fear, given form by the mysterious shadows and shifting perspectives of the bayou landscape? No one can say for certain, but the stories persist, passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that the most dangerous widow in the bayou is never quite forgotten, never quite consigned to history. And so the cycle continues, a perfect recipe of fear and fascination, of horror and hunger, of life emerging from death in endless, terrible abundance. For in the dark, fertile soil of human imagination, such tales take root and flourish, nourished by the universal dread of becoming not just food for worms, but ingredients in someone else's garden of delights.